This is Yamil Sued for Gunstark Reviews. I'm here in Peoria, Arizona at Apex Tactical Specialties. If you're a fan of the Smith Wesson M&P Shield 45, you better listen to this. This is some really cool, exciting news. Scott.
We have our Duty Carry Action Enhancement trigger, which is a solid body machine trigger with a center mounted pivoting safety. We have our striker block spring and our Duty Carry spring kit internally, as well as our sear for the 45 Shield. Our trigger itself features a solid body aluminum machine trigger with a center mounted pivoting safety, unlike the factory hinge trigger. We included our sear, our striker block, and our spring kit in this gun, which produces right about a 5-pound trigger pull, which is suitable for duty carry use in most cases. We reduce pre-travel by about 35% and over-travel by about 60%, giving you the best trigger possible for the M&P45 Shield.
The great thing about these kits is they are very easy to install. Scott showed me earlier today how to install these kits. Let's look at that.
The Apex kit for the M&P45 Shield includes an Apex trigger with the plus engraved on the side to denote for the 45, Talon Tactical rear sight reinstallation tool, Apex Ultimate Striker spring only, 2-dot Apex sear, trigger return spring reinstallation slave pin, Apex Duty Carry sear spring, and trigger return springs. For disassembly and reassembly of the Shield frames, you'll need a hammer, an 1/8 inch or 3/32 inch roll pin punch, a 16th inch pin punch, and an Apex armorer's block or a roll of tape. To remove the takedown lever from the frame, rotate the takedown lever up and pull it out of the frame. As a caution during disassembly, I want to warn you about the little notch in the locking block. The takedown lever needs to be rotated up slightly, and when it gets pulled out, the little tab on the end of the takedown lever goes through the notch. That notch exists on the other end of the block as well, so when you remove it, it should come out very easily. For illustration purposes, we're using a roll of tape currently, but instead we're going to use the Apex armorer's block to disassemble this frame. With the knobs adjusted, you'll be able to press all the pins out through the bottom of the block. I'll take my 1/8 inch roll pin punch, put it on top of the pins, and drive them all the way down. From here, I'll remove the block and set the pins aside. The trigger itself is not under much tension, so I should be able to press the trigger bar pivot pin all the way out. If I can't, I'll just pull it out the bottom. To remove the sear housing block, first I'll press and hold the trigger in the down position. I'll take my pin punch and place it between the frame and the slide rail on the sear housing block. I'll press in and use that to wedge the sear housing block up. Once it's up and out, I'll grab onto the sear housing and wiggle it and pull it out of the frame, disconnecting it from the trigger bar. To remove the locking block and trigger, turn the frame over and pull the locking block up out of the frame. It should slide up and forward. At the same time, your slide lock lever should come out as well. Occasionally, it'll pop right off because it's under spring pressure. This is completely normal. With the locking block and sear housing block out of the frame, grab the trigger bar and pull it out of the frame. On the Shield 45 sear housing block, you'll notice there are 3 flats on the head of the sear pivot pin. This will be crucial for reassembly. To remove the sear and sear spring from the sear housing block, I want to use my 16th inch punch and press the sear pivot pin out from the right side to the left. At the same time, I'll leave my thumb on top to hold the sear in place. Once the pin pushes out, with my thumb in place, I'll slowly remove the pin, which allows me to then relieve pressure from the sear and remove the sear from the block. At the same time, my sear plunger and spring are still inside the block. I'll typically turn them over and tap them on the table till they both fall out. At this point, your frame is fully disassembled. Make sure you keep the factory components just in case you need them for later. To install the factory trigger bar on the Apex trigger, we recommend the following: a hammer, a 5/64 pin punch, and the product card that came with the trigger. We also recommend the Apex trigger assembly block. To install the trigger bar into the trigger, take the trigger, insert it into the slot, and you should click the trigger bar over the pin inside the trigger body. At this point, I've cut off a piece of my product card that came with the trigger, and I'll wedge it inside the trigger body between the trigger bar and the outer wall of the trigger. This is used as a spacer to prevent crushing when I install it in the vise. With the trigger and trigger bar in the right position with the spacer in, I'll put it into the smooth jaws of my vise. I'll clamp down until I just touch, and from here, I'll move the trigger bar up and down and make sure it's in position as I press the pin in place. You should feel the pin going as the trigger bar still continues to move. I'll go until the smooth jaw of the opposite side just touches the trigger body. Do not over torque or you will crush the trigger. I'll remove it from the vice jaws, and now the pin's sticking up ever so slightly from the surface. From here I'll go to the anvil of the vice. I'll use my product card to prevent wear. I'll take my pin punch and my hammer, and I'll set the punch on top of the pin and just tap it down to make sure it's just below flush on the body. Might take a couple of tries, but be cautious about it and you won't damage the trigger body. From here we're fully assembled and the trigger bar articulates smoothly. All Apex trigger return springs come with a felt core. We recommend a drop of any gun grade oil be applied to that before installation. This will help attenuate recoil and dampen vibration. To install the trigger return spring, take the small end of the spring with the hook in the down position. Hook the end of the spring over the trigger bar and into the hole behind the trigger. Once it's there, we roll the return spring up into the trigger body into position for assembly. You'll notice that the opening on the trigger bar in the trigger loop is in the up position when it's installed into the trigger body. This is the proper position for installation. With the trigger return spring in position, we'll take the green slave pin, which is bright green so you can find it if you drop it on the ground. Take the beveled end, put it in from the left side of the trigger to the right, and make sure it captures inside the trigger return spring as you put it in. When installed, it should sit flush to the outside of the trigger body. If not, I use the side of my punch to seat it in position. From here, I'll hold around the pin and I'll pull the trigger bar down and make sure the trigger return spring flexes. At this point, the trigger bar is ready to be reinstalled into the frame. The first step of reassembling the frame is reassembling the sear housing block. Before we get started, I want to point out the differences between the Apex 2-dot sear and the factory MEM sear. The Apex sear has 2 dots machined on the rear. The factory sear is typically silver in color and has a larger hole at the back. When working with such small components, we recommend taking your time and making sure you get it right. Make sure you have plenty of light and take a deep breath and take your time. I'll start with the sear spring. I'll put it on the end of my pin punch and I'll fish it into the hole into the sear housing block. Once I get it in place, I can push the spring down just where it sits. You don't want to compress the spring at this point. My pin punch happens to be magnetic, so I'll try to pick up the tip of the plunger and put it on top of the spring. Once I have that in position, I can set the sear on top and put the sear pin through from the left to the right. When installing the sear pin on the 45 shield, you'll have to align the 3 flats on the pin to the ejector. What I'll do is I'll press the pin out slightly so I can get a hold of it with my fingers, rotate it into what looks like the right position, and then I'll press the pin all the way down. When it's all the way in, it should seat sub-flush on the left side. From here, we'll install the slide lock lever onto the locking block by pushing it up underneath the spring and pushing it into the forward position. At this point, you can see through the hole. At this point, we'll install the trigger bar and trigger into the frame as well as the locking block. The trigger goes in first and goes all the way down into its mortise. We'll take the locking block with the assembled slide lock lever, we'll set it on top. We'll slide the locking block all the way down until it's in position. Sometimes the trigger needs to get moved around to allow that to happen. From here, we're going to try to look into the hole in the frame where the trigger pivot pin goes and try to see that green slave pin through the hole. Once you can see the green slave pin in position, you should see a full circle inside the hole. At this point, you may need to depress the trigger safety and trigger to get it to align. From here, I'll take the trigger pivot pin, put it in the frame, and try to press it all the way through. You may have to wiggle the safety in the trigger to get it in place. Once it's aligned, you'll feel it start to shoot through, and at this point, the slave pin will normally pop right out. Continue pressing until it's all the way in the position. Normally, you don't need to use a hammer, and whatever you do, don't force it. To install the complete sear housing block, I recommend pulling the trigger and safety all the way down and holding the trigger bar up and to the right side of the frame. At this point, I'll take the sear housing block and I'm going to put the extension of the trigger bar, this little piece at the back, into the notch on the side of the sear housing block right below the sear cam lobe. Sometimes this takes a little bit of extra wiggling and jiggling to get it to go into position properly. Once there, you'll be able to lock the frame rails into position and drop it all the way down into the frame. If it doesn't go all the way down, turn it over and double check your sear pin hasn't popped out. If it has, like this one, push it back in and you'll be able to seat the sear housing block all the way down. At this point, we're ready to reinstall frame pins. I'll take my armorer's block and set the frame on top so I can reinstall my pins from the left to the right. I'll take either of the coil roll pins, put it in the hole, and I'll take my hammer and begin seating the pin down on top of the frame. Once I get within about a 1/4 inch, I'll take my coil roll pin punch and I'll final seat the pin where it's just flush with the frame. Now I'll turn the frame around and I'll put the rear pin in as well. Same process. On the rear pin, you want to make sure it's just sub-flush of the frame. The final step of reassembling the frame is reinstalling the takedown lever. I want to make sure the pin sticking out of the takedown lever goes back in appropriately. I'll line it up with the hole in the frame, and it should drop right in. I also need to realign it at the back on the opposite side. Once it's aligned, it'll push right in place. Then I can rotate down 90 degrees under spring tension, and now my frame is ready for reassembly. At this point, we're going to check trigger safety function. The trigger safety should completely disengage and allow the trigger to go to the rear. When released, the safety should return all the way out on its own. When you press the trigger body only, the safety should prevent the trigger from going all the way back until it's depressed, in which case the trigger can move. This is normal function. If it doesn't do this, call your Apex dealer immediately. So now we're going to check the function of the sear itself. Make sure the yellow takedown lever is in the up position. When you pull the trigger, you should see the sear tip down in the firing position. From here, press the trigger bar to the side. You'll notice the sear pop back down and then release slowly till the trigger bar resets and then re-engage to pull the sear up. I do this a few times just to double check that everything is functioning properly. At this point, your frame is ready for standard reassembly. For installation of the striker block kit, you'll need a hammer, an aluminum or brass punch or something non-marring, preferably wrapped in tape, a diamond lap, and a 1/16 Allen wrench. When removing the rear sight from the M&P shield, you're going to have to use a bench vise, and we recommend smooth jaws. What I like to do is I like to take the Apex product card that came with the item and I fold it in thirds to make a vise pad out of it. I'll put the slide into that, and I'll drop it down into the vise jaws and then clamp onto it. Be aware of crushing the slide with the vise. If you go too hard, you can crush the slide. The factory rear sight set screw uses a 1/16 Allen wrench to be removed. Because we're going to be hammering the sight out, I recommend complete removal of the screw at this point. From here, we need to remove the rear sight from the right to the left. I have my aluminum punch wrapped in tape. I'm going to put the punch right on the angle right at the back of the slide, right into the dovetail. I will angle it down roughly 45 degrees as I hit it with the hammer. From here, I'll tap the sight out until the side of the sight meets the center of the slide. Be aware that sometimes the rear sights are very difficult to remove. I recommend a smaller hammer, such as a jeweler's hammer, for this process as opposed to a larger hammer. Once I get my sight in position, as I remove my punch, you can see the rear sight washer, the washer under the rear sight sticking up. That is under spring tension, so don't pull the punch away or it will spring off. From here, I'll pull out the washer and spring, set that aside, and now I'm going to disassemble that and put our spring on top. To remove the factory spring, we're just going to grab onto the washer and pull the piece off. At this point, we'll take the Apex spring and we'll put it back on. It doesn't matter which end. That'll go right onto the nub on the washer. Install the Apex spring into the striker block and seat it all the way down. There should be a little bit of spring tension on it at this point. I'll take the Talon tactical tool that comes with the kit, put it on the edge of the dovetail. I'll use my pin punch and press the plunger down, the washer down into the hole, sliding the Talon tool all the way across, letting it overtake my pin until I hit the sight. Now, I'll hold the Talon tool in place while I grab my hammer and start driving the sight back across and pushing the Talon tool out. With the Talon tool in place, I'll put my palm against the Talon tool and I'll use my other hand to grab the pin punch. From here, I'll take my hammer and I'll drive the sight back across while allowing the Talon tool to get pushed out. And as I go, eventually the Talon tool will fall off the end, and now I can hold my pin punch on the other side and tap it across. At this point, I'm trying to recenter the rear sight in the slide. Recommend using calipers to measure from the side to the sight on both sides and get equal measurements to make sure your sight is recentered. Once you've done that, take your rear sight set screw, reinstall, torque it down till it's snug, which isn't a lot, and remove it, and you're finished. Once the rear sight's reinstalled, we want to do a safety check as well. We'll flip the slide over. We'll press on the striker from the back and make sure it does not protrude into the breech, which in this case it doesn't. I'll press the striker block down and press the striker up, in which case it does protrude into the breech. When I release the striker block and let go of the striker, it should pop back and re-engage the lock. As with any time you work on sights, you're going to want to go to the range and proof that make sure they're back on target. What you can do at the start is take a pencil mark from the sight to the slide and just mark it ever so slightly so you can realign it later. With the frame reassembled, we want to do a full function check. I'll press the trigger without pressing the safety in. See, the trigger will not fully move. I'll depress the safety, pull the trigger, and make sure it goes all the way down. From here, I'll reset the striker and double check again function. Once the striker drops, hold the trigger down, cycle the slide, release slowly for reset, and then re-engage and fire.
Great. So you can call your dealer and ask for the trigger kit for the M&P Shield 45 from Apex Tactical Specialties.
Absolutely.
This is really cool. We're going to take this pistol to the range here pretty soon and run it through its paces, shoot a little bit, and just give the viewer first-hand review and first-hand impressions on how this thing performs.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Scott.
Thank you.
Thank you for everything. Do you see how easy that was? Even I could do that. So if you need any specific details on how to install any of the Apex trigger kits, please look at their YouTube channel where there will be specific detailed videos for the installation of all their kits.
Thank you for watching Gunstock Reviews. Please visit our website at www.gunstockreviews.com for more exclusive content. Please visit our Patreon page at www.patreon.com/gunstockreviews. Your contributions would be greatly appreciated and help us grow our selections and frequency of videos.